So I'd like to start this week with an overview of sociological thinking. Talk a little bit about specifically what makes the sociological approach distinct and unique from other ways of making sense of the social world. So to begin, let's make it clear what we mean when we talk about sociology. Um, as you probably know, it is a science. It's a scholarly discipline specifically concerned with the systematic study of what we call social organization, which I'll talk about here in just a moment. Um, there are a couple of things that kind of float around in the popular culture with regard to sociology that are kind of misunderstandings or misperceptions. The first is that sociology is not the study of individuals. We do collect data about individuals very often in our research, and we certainly do a lot of observation of individuals, but it is not for the purposes of understanding individuals. What we are trying to understand um, are things that are happening at the aggregate level, at the shared level, which again, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in a moment. But the data that we collect from and about individuals is not in pursuit of a project where we're trying to understand those individuals. Rather, what we're going to do is we're going to aggregate those data to see if we can recognize broad patterns, things that are true about the society itself. The second misperception out there, and I'm not sure how common this one is anymore, but when I was an undergraduate, this was actually something that I bumped into quite a bit. It is this assumption that sociology is essentially just sort of common sense, but dressed up in sort of academic robes or clothing. That we take things that everybody kind of already knows to be true about society, and we sort of just put them into sort of obscure academic language. In fact, sociology is really kind of the opposite of that, right? What we do is we take the taken for granted nature, the taken for granted aspects of everyday life, the things that people assume are common sense, and we kind of critique and unpack and challenge them and discover, probably more often than not, that what people think is true about the world that they live in is not actually true. That common sense, while it is very, very common, is often very inaccurate. So those two things are kind of useful to keep somewhere in the back of your head when you think about what it is that sociology is, but also, of course, what sociology is not. There are three assumptions that, at least three, I'm going to focus on three. There are three prominent assumptions of the sociological perspective that I would like you guys to also have a general familiarity with. And I want to say a quick thing about assumptions, especially assumptions in the field of science, both physical sciences and the social sciences. Assumptions sometimes have to be made. What we would really love to do, because we are scientists, because we're empirically grounded, because we look for independent verification of the things that we think are true of the world, or we suspect are true of the world. But for a variety of reasons, sometimes things can't be independently verified. And when that is the case, it sometimes necessitates the stipulation to a certain set of conditions, the assumption that something is true. The assumptions that I'm going to share with you are predicated on the fact that to test them, we would have to do some pretty unethical things. And because we are guided by a system of ethics that will not allow us to do these things, we cannot directly test and therefore can't independently verify the claims that I'm about to share with you. But there's a tremendous amount of inferential data that support this. This is, these assumptions are so virtually unassailable that they really aren't tenuous the way that a lot of assumptions are. But again, you'll see in a moment what I'm getting at. So the first assumption of the sociological perspective is that people are, by their nature, social beings. And when I say by their nature, I mean not just their sort of inclination to form associations and social connections. That's absolutely true. But I mean even on a more fundamental level, right? That if you took a human infant and you took it out into the woods and you left it there, it would die, right? No question. Humans at birth, as organisms, lack the capacity to sustain their own lives. They don't know how to recognize predators and differentiate predators from sources of food. They're not protected from disease or the elements by either natural immunities or thick, heavy fur coats or things like that, right? We're kind of vulnerable. We're born relatively early in our developmental process in the stages of development as organisms. We kind of come out of the womb relatively early, and it's because we have these massive craniums, right? Even a small baby is still, quite a large thing to pass through a birth canal, because there are these tremendously large heads involved with these gigantic brains inside them. So the trade-off is, of course, to have the cognitive resources and capacities that come along with having these great big old brains. We arrive a little bit early in our developmental process, and the remainder of our development occurs what we call ex utero, right, outside the womb. That only works, of course, if we are born into social environments. It only works if we're born into organized patterns of arrangements and interactions that allow us to be nurtured and fed and clothed and protected and survive until we reach a point where we can be autonomous. So when I say we are social beings by nature, that is really fundamental. We cannot, sometimes there's a distinction drawn in conversations between nature and nurture. Nature referring to genetics and biology and all of that, and nurture referring to environment and social inputs. But here's the thing: nurture is our nature, right? That you can't meaningfully disentangle those two things because they will always work, in an interconnected fashion. So that's the first assumption, right? That people are, by their nature, social beings. To test that, right, we could take a newborn infant, we could put it in the woods, we could deprive it of social contact and see what happens. But again, monstrously unethical practice. We wouldn't do that. We shouldn't do that. So we have to make this assumption. But again, the evidence, the inferential and sort of indirect evidence for this claim is quite strong. The second assumption, all of these are interconnected, by the way. So the second assumption is that people are, for the most part, socially determined. Now, this assumption is predicated or reflects, I guess, the idea that human behavior, right, all of the things that we see people do, human behavior is explained to the greatest degree by social factors. There is a lot made of genetics. There's a lot made of individual biological propensity, but the vast majority of the things that we observe when we observe human behavior originate in society, not in the organism. Language, right? The capacity for language is something we're certainly born with. The language that we acquire comes from outside of us. It doesn't originate inside and then just sort of manifest, right? It's a socially shared, socially created sort of phenomenon. So the things that people do, the things that people say, the values that they hold, the beliefs they embrace, the cultural practices and the norms, the actual behavioral expectations, all of those things come for the most part from society. Yes, not to say that there isn't a role for things related to us as organisms, but the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of human behavior is social in nature. It originates in social patterns and social structures and social organizations, and that we essentially become carriers of that, right? That society is operating through us. We put into action social expectations. That's the second assumption. The third assumption is that people create, sustain, and change the social forms within which they conduct their lives. What that means, of course, is that all of these structures around us that are shaping us by providing inputs, by providing guidelines, by providing incentives to conform and disincentives to deviate, right? We can change those, right? If society is indeed socially constructed, then we can construct it in whatever fashion we see fit as a collective. We can't do that as individuals because an individual person in a society of, say, for example, the United States of over 320 million people, one person going against the grain doesn't change the grain. It's if you get hundreds of thousands or millions of people going against the grain, yeah, the grain will change. So when we talk about constructing or reconstructing social forms, the social forms that surround us, this is always going to be a collective endeavor, right? So it's very, very important to remember that one person does not, change their behavior and then the world suddenly follows. Okay, so there are some implications of this set of assumptions. Again, especially this last one, and I want to kind of just briefly touch on them. The first implication of all of this is that social structure is human-made. I don't think that's too much of a stretch, but social structure does not exist independent of the people who create it through their behaviors. Social structures, because they are made by humans, are imperfect, right? The structures that we see around us in 21st century America, or whatever society at whatever point in time you care to look at, those structures are imperfect. But again, the good news is they can be changed, and that leads to the third implication, which is that the structure of society can be changed through collective action. But again, the emphasis is always going to be on the collective. And the fourth implication of this, and this one is something that people often kind of miss out on, especially in sociology, which tends to emphasize the impact that society has on people. But individuals, the people who make up society, are not passive, right? We can, if we are properly informed, collectively oriented, and organized, we can change our society. That makes us active, right? This notion of social construction and social determinism kind of working side by side, I think is kind of emancipatory, right? If you think about it the right way, it actually is quite liberating, right? That the world that we live in is not the one we're stuck with. We can keep the elements that we like, or the elements that work. We can abandon the ones that don't and replace them with new ones. And that only works, of course, if people aren't just the passive recipients of social inputs. I think the thing that people often get wrong is thinking that the change can originate with an individual rather than necessarily has to originate through collective action. And that'll be a theme that we see a lot over the course of the semester as we explore social problems. And the way that people respond to social problems by trying to address them and either eliminate them or ameliorate the effects of those problems. Okay, so that's sociology kind of in an overarching sort of sense. Emile Durkheim, fairly famous late 19th, early 20th century French sociologist, had a lot of contributions to the discipline. I think, arguably Durkheim creates a sort of legitimacy for sociology that had not been present up to that point. And, if you have questions, we can certainly spend some time in class talking about Durkheim. He's, a very interesting sociologist. But I wanted to just bring him into the conversation briefly to recognize one of his most valuable contributions, which is the kind of clear and lucid focus on what it is that sociology as a discipline is going to study, and what we are going to study, what is the core of our sociological inquiry, what Durkheim would call our theoretical object, is the social fact, right? Now, a social fact is essentially a thing that is true of society, right? It's a pattern that exists at the level of society, that is a consequence of people engaging in established manners of action and thought. So we as members of society are socialized. We are taught over time how it is we are supposed to behave in a wide variety of situations. And when we behave accordingly in those given situations, we create patterns. And those patterns are what we call social facts. Now, remember, a fact, well, maybe you don't need to remember this. Maybe it's something that needs to be sort of established first. Some of you, I suspect, already kind of have this understanding, but we live in a world where people will casually talk about things like alternative facts. So now it's kind of incumbent on me to point out that there are no such thing as alternative facts. Facts are just things that are true. If something is legitimately debatable, it's not a fact, right? So definitionally, facts are things that are true, and they're true for everyone. Now, there are all kinds of different facts that exist out there. There are inconvenient facts, right? Ones that kind of undermine what we think is true of the world. There are social facts. There are biological facts. A biological fact would be something that is true of humans as organisms, for example. A social fact is a thing that is true of a society. And the interesting thing about a social fact, and why they're so both fascinating and frustrating, is that a social fact can exist, right? A pattern can exist for a society, and you can also have in that society people who do not manifest that fact, right? Durkheim very famously studied suicide, and he did some comparisons of suicide rates between, say, Catholics and Protestants, or married people and single people. And one of the things that he found was that Protestants had a higher rate of suicide than Catholics, and single people had a higher rate of suicide than married people. So those things are facts. Those things are true. Protestants have a higher rate of suicide. Single people have a higher rate of suicide. That does not mean that Catholics never commit suicide. It doesn't mean that all Protestants eventually will commit suicide, right? So you can have Protestants that live a long, happy, suicide-free life, and you can have Catholics who, end it all prematurely. The fact that people deviate from the pattern doesn't change the pattern, however. To make it a little bit more immediate and maybe contemporary, right? All of you are pursuing some kind of credential, some kind of set of college credits or degrees that presumably, among other things, will help you find and secure a better job than the one that you could get if you just went out looking for a job right now. So we can look at lifetime earnings, right? So all the money a person earns over the course of their lifetime, and we can compare people with college degrees to people without college degrees. And not surprisingly, I suspect to any of you, people with college degrees make more money than people without college degrees. But, right, there's your social fact, but are there high school dropouts who will earn more money than people with master's degrees and PhDs? Absolutely, right? Doesn't invalidate the pattern, right? The pattern is that you're better off with a college degree than without one, but just because you have a college degree doesn't mean it's going to happen for you specifically. So that's what we mean in sociology when we talk about the things at the aggregate level, right? We're talking about truths or things that are true of groups of people. And for a lot of people who aren't used to looking at the world that way, the existence of counterexamples, might lead one to think that the claim is invalid. But the thing that you want to remember is the presence of a high school dropout who's making a lot of money doesn't invalidate the fact that that's not a typical experience of a high school dropout, especially relative to somebody with a college degree. So that's what we mean by social facts, right? Things that are true of society. So I said I wanted to say a few things about social organization. So let me talk a little bit about social organization, because that in the end is really what we're trying to understand through a sort of data-driven and scientifically organized framework, right, that we call sociology. So social organization is essentially just the order of a social group, right? So what does a society look like? What are the positions within the structures of those societies? Who occupies those positions? What are the roles and the norms, right? What are the things that people in those positions are supposed to do? What are the constraints? What are the things that kind of limit what people can do or are able to do? Right, so that social organization, that's the thing that we kind of want to understand. We want to understand how that order comes about. And social organization is a social fact. Now, it gets fine-grained, right? We don't normally look at social organization as a social fact. We would look at a particular pattern within social organization and say that's a social fact. But the social order itself is also a social fact. And so that's the thing that we're chasing. That's the thing that we're trying to understand. And it's a moving target, right? The really exasperating thing sometimes is that we're trying to study something systematically to arrive at some definitive understandings of that thing, and that thing that we're studying is constantly changing, right? And so, one of the things you're going to figure out fairly quickly about sociology is that a lot of its understandings, a lot of its conclusions are contingent, right? They're specific to a moment in history, or they're specific to a particular set of material conditions or spatial arrangements. So one of the things you'll see if you haven't taken a sociology class before is the absolute importance of a historical understanding of things and a materialist understanding of things, because society is grounded, right? It's a thing that exists in the world, and so as a result of that, it's constantly being affected by the world, and the world is a constantly changing place. So we're going to look at social organization and social order, but one of the things that I'm going to try to do as often as possible is remind us of how the present moment is really a function of the stuff that came before, of what we call antecedent conditions, right? The way things were before this present moment. And the way things are in this present moment is going to have a shaping influence on what happens next. Just like where things are happening matters, when things are happening matters. So, if you want to think about disciplines that are kind of closely aligned with sociology, I know a lot of people think it's psychology, but actually the disciplines that are probably closest to sociology are things like geography and history, maybe economics and political science. Psychology really doesn't impinge very much or overlap very much with sociological inquiry, because while psychologists also study individuals, it is for the purpose of understanding what's going on with individuals. And because the theoretical object, the thing that those two disciplines are trying to understand, are so completely different, there's a lot less overlap there than people think. I talked about constraints as I was describing social organization. So let me just say a couple things about the two kinds of conditions that constrain social order and social organization that we are going to spend some time on. The first is culture, and the second is structure. So culture, we'll start there, and we'll transition over to structure in a moment. Culture. Think of culture as the entirety of all of the things and all of the ideas that are passed down from generation to generation within a society. It consists of material components, right? The artifacts, the objects that we create or adapt from the world around us. It also consists of the ideas, what we would call non-material elements or non-material culture, things like symbols and language and values and norms and beliefs, right? Those sorts of things that we carry around in our minds as bearers of culture, as people who have been socialized to and internalized a particular culture. We become the bearers of that culture, and the shared nature of our culture allows us to behave in ways that create and sustain social order, and sometimes change it if we have to. In the broad sociological tradition, there are people who have spent a lot of time sort of looking at and thinking about culture, and there are two broad patterns that you can attribute to people, doing a sociological analysis through a kind of cultural lens. The first group of people view culture as a product of action, that culture is a thing that we create. We act in certain ways in response to the historical moment and the material conditions in the society around us. And the patterns of behavior that we engage in as a result of that create a particular kind of culture. So, material conditions. A society where there is scarcity is going to have a very different culture than a society characterized by abundance, right? So you can kind of see a very simple, but I hope understandable example of what I mean by material conditions. So as we respond to and address the needs of our society, we create these patterns that we call culture. Another group of sociologists kind of working in this vein look at culture and see it as a conditioning element of future action. In other words, it's something that shapes what we are going to do, right? So our actions are guided by culture. But culture is also created by our actions, as I just pointed out in the previous point. This is what we call a paradox, right? A paradox is a situation in which there are two simultaneously true but contradictory claims, right? So culture is something that gets created through our actions. It is also something that guides the actions that we engage in. So think of the chicken and egg dilemma, right? Where do we get chickens? Well, they come from eggs. Where do you get eggs? Well, they come from chickens. Both of those things are true. But they seem to, sort of not give us a satisfactory answer about the origins of all of these things. And the good news is we don't need to unravel the origins. We need to be comfortable with paradox. But as long as you are comfortable with the idea that the stuff we carry around in our minds conditions us to behave in particular ways, but then those behaviors get created, recreated, and reinforced as we engage in them, right? And that's how this kind of paradoxical aspect of culture can kind of get resolved, and we can live with it long enough to move on to look at other things that are also contributing. And the other thing that is also contributing in our case is social structure. Social structure are kind of the patterned and recurring relationships that exist among people and among the parts in a social organization. So Harper College is a really good place where you can kind of see on a small scale, on a micro level, what social structure looks like. So every Tuesday we come together and we sit down and imagine it's any semester, right? Whatever day of the week or days of the week that we're meeting, we come together, we sit down in a classroom. You guys do student things, I do teacher things. And in the doing of those things, we create a structure called Sociology 205, social problems. That structure exists because we have a patterned and recurring relationship that we engage in, on a regular basis. It is one of many different classes that are going on at Harper College in any given semester. And surrounding all of those classes are other structures as well. There's a division office on the second floor of J building. And that division office does administrative oversight for not just sociology and anthropology, but also history and political science and geography and business and economics. What am I missing? Education, right? All of these different disciplines, psychology, all of these different disciplines with classes are kind of lumped together into a division called business and social science. And if you look around the campus, you'll see that in addition to business and social science, there's a division for liberal arts where you would find English and humanities and philosophy classes and speech classes. There's a science division, right? Math and science are a division, and within there you'd find physics and chemistry and biology and geology. So again, those are the kind of the administrative structures on the academic side of Harper College. But then there's like all of the other stuff that Harper College needs to have taken care of. Somebody has to make sure that the parking lots are plowed and that the trash is collected and that there's food prepared for the students and the faculty and the staff, and that the air conditioners or the heaters are running, right? So there are all these physical needs built into running the tangible, concrete, geographically specific place that we call Harper College, right? The campus. That involves other groups and other structures that people create because they come together and they engage in particular patterned and recurring relationships. So we build this structure called Harper College by showing up and doing certain things according to the social expectations that have been sort of established for teachers and students and janitors and groundskeepers and administrators and college presidents and people in the accounting office and the registrar and all those others. That is social structure, right? And so the thing is, it's really hard sometimes to see that as structure, because when we look at people behaving, what we see are people behaving. And it's really easy sometimes to fall into a trap and assume that the behavior that we see is a reflection of the individuals who are engaging in it, rather than the social expectations that are driving those behaviors. Seeing that relationship, right? Seeing the way in which society and social expectations are actually the primary drivers of human behavior requires that we develop what Mills calls a sociological imagination, right? That ability to imagine the impact that society is having on the members of society. So we're gonna talk a lot about structure in this class. We'll talk a little bit about culture too, because I think one of the things that often gets overlooked in analyses of social problems is the degree to which those problems can sometimes arise as a failure of values, right? Social values that people embrace and accept, but then ultimately aren't necessarily delivered as consistently as they're promised. So we'll do some cultural analysis as well, but we're really probably, as sociologists, right, we're mostly going to be focusing on structure. And the structures that we're going to focus on the most in this class, because it's a macro sociology class, we're looking at the large processes and structures within a society. We're going to look at social institutions. That will be probably the most common set of recurring patterns or relationships that we focus on, will be those that we find vested in these various social institutions. And a social institution is just a set of ideas and a set of practices that are built around addressing a really important basic social need. The basic important social needs are common to all societies. And I mean all societies at all points in time, in all places around the world. There are within those societies the same basic set of social needs, right? So education, right? Education as a social institution is just all the arrangements that we've made so that people who have information and skills can pass them on to the generation that doesn't. That's all education is, right? The intergenerational transfer of skills and knowledge. When we lived in hunting and gathering groups, right? These little nomadic groups that were doing subsistence a sort of subsistence economy where you gathered the food you ate, or you hunted the food you ate. That was really a really simple system. So the education that existed occurred primarily through experience, a little bit of word of mouth, but a lot of experiential education. Doing was how you learned. And the people who guided you through that process of doing were the ones who already knew how to do those things, right? So people tell you, don't eat these berries, eat these berries, because these berries over here will kill you. They're poisonous. Here's how you set a trap for an animal, or here's how you make you do flint knapping to make a point for a spear so you can kill an animal, right? Those things are being done um, in the environments where those activities occur. You don't go to college in a hunting and gathering society to major in buffalo hunting with a minor in gathering berries, right? It's not formal education the way we think of education today. But the reason why education today looks the way it does is because our economy and our society has become incredibly complex, highly specialized, incredibly narrow skill sets. And because of that, we've made these arrangements for a kind of education system that will give everybody in the first couple decades of their life, or the first decade and a half of their life, some general, broad, socially useful information and training. And then as you spend more time in the education system, your specialization narrows, right? That's what we call majoring in a subject. And then, maybe even going and pursuing advanced degrees in that area of specialization. But at the end of the day, whether we're talking about people pursuing bachelor's and master's degrees in highly specialized and technical fields, or somebody learning not to eat the purple berries, we're talking about a process of education. So those two things are the same in the sense that they are the institutions of those two separate societies, right? So when we say that institutions are common to all societies, we don't mean the form they take, but rather the need that's being addressed. So we need a set of arrangements through which new members of society can be brought into the world, and in which they can receive the early childhood socialization and nurturing that will allow them to become autonomous members of society. That particular set of needs is addressed through a set of institutional arrangements that we call family. Now, what a family looks like, how families are brought together, who is responsible for what things within the structure of that family, those are all culturally contingent, right? It depends on our point in history. It depends on the cultural features of a given society. It depends on the geographic realities and the material conditions. But at the end of the day, a family in 21st century America, while it might not look very much like a family in 3rd century Britain, they're still doing basically the same thing. They're still addressing the same basic social need. So think of things like education or family or economy or politics or race or religion or health or science or media. All of these things are common to all societies, and how we address them and what form they take, that's the thing that's variable. But as sociologists, we're really interested in institutions. We're really interested in the way in which diverse societies address the same basic set of needs, and why it is, or how it is, to be more precise, a particular set of organizational features emerge as people try to address those, questions. All right, so that's kind of an overview of what sociology focuses on and sort of some of the underlying assumptions. There are a couple of other things that I'd like to point out, just some really quick hits. And we'll talk a little bit about these, I think, in class, because I like to kind of elaborate on them. The first is the need for everybody to get comfortable with the idea of skepticism. Skepticism is a cornerstone of scientific inquiry, not just the social sciences, all science. What happens, you see, by the mid-18th century, so by the 1700s, science has more or less replaced tradition, faith, scripture, in explanations of the natural world. That doesn't mean those things went away. There are still people out there today who, their understanding of the physical world, the planet on which they live, is immensely shaped by the religious and scriptural traditions of their faith community. A good example of that might be people who are like young Earth creationists. They believe the Earth is somewhere on the order of about 10,000 years old. Right, wrong, but nevertheless, people believe because that's the nature of belief. You can believe things that seem to be at odds with factually established truth, and how you square that circle is entirely up to you. But broadly speaking, today, right, in the 21st century, and I would argue even by the time we get to the 1700s and maybe the early 1800s, science is really kind of the go-to answer, the go-to explanation for the natural world. How does this world that we live on come to be, and how does it work, and what are the principles of operation? And there's an underlying assumption here. There we are again with assumptions. There's an underlying assumption here of something we call philosophical naturalism. So philosophical naturalism is just an idea, an assumption that the universe that we live in is governed by a set of principles, rules, if you will. And those rules operate consistently. The reason why we can dismiss the claims of young Earth creationists who argue that the Earth is about 10,000 years old is that we've found objects on the planet that are older than 10,000 years, right? So you can't have something on the planet that's older than the planet. There's no logic to that. The reason we know that these objects are older than 10,000 years is we use radiometric dating, and the mechanics of that we won't get into, but just suffice it to say, the decay of carbon atoms occurs at a rate that we know. And so we can look at a piece of organic material and we can look at the ratio of the different forms of the carbon atom in that piece of organic material. And based on that ratio, we can say within a few hundred years how old an object is. So as soon as we find something that's older than 10,000 years, the claim that the Earth is only 10,000 years old can be dismissed. That doesn't mean the people who believe it abandon their belief. It just means that it's clearly a belief and not, a fact. So the problem is, of course, that when you hold on to beliefs, when you hold on to ways of understanding the world that are incorrect, maybe because they're comfortable, maybe because you don't want to offend or trouble anyone, maybe whatever it is, whatever particular itch that behavior scratches, it can be problematic, right? If the thing that people are holding on to isn't just wrong but harmful, it's really, really important that people find a way to move on from the incorrect and harmful things that they believe in favor of more accurate models of the world that we live in. And the way you do this is you remain open to the idea that what you think you know may not be correct. That's skepticism. It's not the disbelief in the things that people claim. It's the willingness to recognize that a claim is a claim, right? And as such, it can be subjected to scrutiny and analysis and critical thinking, and sometimes even scientific testing, right? So, if I were to say, this seltzer is awesome, well, that's an opinion, right? That doesn't lend itself to any kind of testing, right? There's no suckometer that we can hold up against the can and go, oh my God, he's right. It's awesome, right? Or, oh no, he's wrong. It sucks. We can still debate. Opinions, and sometimes it's a lot of fun to do. But one of the things that's really nice about an empirical study, right, and a study based in evidence and data, one of the things that's really nice about that is that we can we can subject some claims to actual empirical testing. So back to my can of seltzer, right? There's no way for me to test whether or not seltzer is awesome. We can certainly poll people and we can say, most people think seltzer is awesome, or most people think seltzer sucks. But that isn't the same thing as proving that seltzer is awesome, because awesome is a very subjective judgment. There's nothing empirical or grounded. If, on the other hand, I make a claim that this can contains 32 ounces of seltzer, well, now we're in the realm of science, because we can take the fluid in this can of seltzer and we can pour it into something that's marked according to a system of measurement that we all agree on, and either there are 32 ounces of fluid in this can or there aren't. And if there aren't, I can go on believing that there are 32 ounces in there, but that doesn't make it 32 ounces of fluid. 32 ounces of fluid is an objectively determinable thing. So what we want to do with regard to our understanding of the world around us is always be willing to recognize that what we think we know about the world around us may not be correct. And wherever possible, we should scrutinize our claims. We should subject them to testing. We should use data. We should use scientific methodologies to ascertain the veracity of those claims. And we should be looking for what, and I mentioned these earlier, but we should be looking for what Max Weber, who's another sort of early sociologist, calls inconvenient facts, facts that go against or undermine what we think is true, because inconvenient facts will help us over time generate better understandings of the world that we live in. Lots of different examples of inconvenient facts. So, for example, in the United States, there's a really, really deeply held belief among most people, not everybody, but a lot of people, that we are what's called a meritocracy, right? A meritocracy is just a society that's organized based on the abilities and contributions of the people who make up that society. So smart, hardworking, industrious people will rise to the top. Lazy, unintelligent, and unmotivated people will gravitate toward the bottom. And by top and bottom, I mean socioeconomic status, relative quality and length of life and all of those sorts of things. That's what meritocracy is. Most people in the United States believe that the United States is a meritocracy. But maybe you don't know this. The single best determinant, right? So when we look at all the variables that go into what we call status attainment, right, which is upper class, middle class, working class, lower class. How do you get there? How do you stay there, right? The study of that is the study of what we call status attainment. When we look at the variables that account for the statuses that people hold, the single best predictor of anybody's socioeconomic status is their parents' socioeconomic status, which is not meritocracy, right? If the single best predictor of whether you are going to be middle class or not is that your parents were middle class, then the United States is not a meritocracy. It might be a perfectly fine society in other regards, but we can take that claim that the United States is a meritocracy, and we can say there's not a lot of evidence that supports that claim. What are some other models? What are some more accurate models? What are some better descriptors for the kind of society the United States actually is, not the one that we wish it was? There are people who believe that gender inequality and gender discrimination in the workplace is no longer an issue. They're welcome to believe that, but the wage gap called, and it begs to differ, right? Because men and women doing identical jobs. This is not, women working as elementary school teachers and men working as international finance advisors in the banking structures of our country. This is elementary school teachers who are male, elementary school teachers who are female. Investment bankers who are male, investment bankers who are female, right? So we're making an apples to apples comparison. And when we do make that comparison, we see that there still, in the 21st century, exists a wage gap. Women earn less than men in identical occupations. There could be a whole lot of different explanations for how we end up in that situation, but definitionally, that means that women are being treated differently than men, which is the definition of discrimination, right? So gender discrimination is demonstrated by the persistence of the wage gap. It's an inconvenient fact for those who want to pretend like that's not true, but just because somebody wants something not to be true doesn't make it so. So as people engaged in a kind of empirical and evidence-based analysis of the social world, we want to be open to the idea that what we think we know about the world might be wrong. And if it might be wrong, we want to challenge it. Because we want to be right, right? That's the thing about skepticism. It's not really a problem. A lot of people, we have a value in this society that certainty is something that carries a lot of weight, right? Being sure about something, being confident, being certain. But being certain about something that's wrong is actually deeply problematic. I would rather be uncertain because one of two things is going to happen. If I have an idea about the way the world works and I subject it to testing, I subject it to kind of a rigorous analysis, I will find one of two things. One, I was right. Yay. Or I was wrong, in which case I now have the opportunity to change what I think I know about the world to something that might be a little bit more accurate. So it's a win-win, right? If you're wrong, it gives you the opportunity to not be wrong anymore. And if you're right, it helps, to reinforce the idea that you were correct. So skepticism is only risky if you value certainty over accuracy. And there are people out there who do value certainty over accuracy, but I would argue again that those people are potentially, impediments to the creation of a better and more inclusive and equitable society, because many of them might walk around pretending like there aren't problems. And again, that's going to be an issue because this is a class in which we are going to look at social problems. All right, so let me say a couple quick things about critical reasoning and some of the features of science and some basic terms that you might already know, but I just want to reintroduce them. Critical reasoning is an assessment of the logical and empirical adequacy of a nonfiction statement. So this is what we are going to be doing. We're going to be looking at claims about the social world, and we're going to be subjecting them to critical reasoning. And the beauty of this is a skill that you're going to be able to take and apply to everything else that you do. And you're learning this in your other classes. You're learning this in your other science classes, both social and physical sciences. You're probably also learning it if you're taking any classes in logic or philosophy. Critical reasoning is essentially the application of skepticism. And it's got two elements, right? You look at the definition, you see that you're doing two things. You're assessing logical adequacy, and you're addressing empirical adequacy. Logical adequacy refers to the degree to which the conclusions in the claim follow logically from the premises in the claim. I'll illustrate this with an example in a moment. Empirical adequacy refers to the extent to which a claim is supported by factual information, by data. So here's a claim. Since the 1700s, the number of pirates in the world has been declining. Pirates, arg, right? So we have fewer pirates in the 21st century than we did in the 18th century. It is also, and that's empirically true, right? There are fewer pirates today than there were in the early to mid 1700s. It is also true that in the 21st century, average global temperature is higher than it was in the 18th century. So the planet has gotten warmer. If I were to make the assertion that the rising average global temperature is caused by a decline in pirates, you guys would understandably and correctly sort of, at the very least, roll your eyes a little bit, if not just sort of dismiss the claim outright. Not because it isn't supported by data. Right? The data show that both of those things are true. The problem is that conclusion does not follow from the premises. How on earth would a decline in pirates make the planet warmer, right? There's no logic to that. So that's what we want to do. We want to look at not just the data side of it, we also want to look at the logic side of it, because those two things have to be both aligned for a claim to stand up to the application of skepticism, the application of this principle of critical reasoning. So we want to keep in mind that when we talk about adequacy, we're really kind of at our level, right? For this class, and for a kind of everyday sociology sort of application, it's a really kind of pragmatic consideration, right? It's just the purpose at hand, right? It doesn't have to be, you know, hyper scrutinized, right? We can look at what we call face validity, or yeah, and face validity is probably the best way to think about this. That does the thing stand up to just a quick sort of obvious scrutiny? Interestingly enough, when you do some probing, when you start to look at those not connected, or at least not obviously connected, variables of decline in pirates and a rise in temperature, one of the things you find is that the cause of both of those changes is actually connected, right? So as transnational capitalism, which emerges, capitalism emerges in the 1600s, as transnational capitalism and a global flow of goods and services from the places where they're produced to the places where they're consumed, that requires the ability to move goods and finances across oceans. And to do that, you have to protect those ships from pirates. So the rise of global capitalism means that you have to more aggressively police the shipping lanes, which means you create pressures that lead to the diminishment of piracy. It is also the case that transnational capitalism for the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, and now the 2000s is driven primarily by the burning of fossil fuel. That's the energy of the Industrial Revolution, was coal, and then later natural gas and other carbon-based energy sources, which emit greenhouse gases, which help raise global average temperature. So the decline in pirates doesn't cause global warming, but the thing that led to the decline in pirates is the same thing as what led to the increase in average global temperature. So when you take claims about the world and you start to look at them through this kind of applied skepticism, it leads you to better insights. It leads you to more accurate insights. You can start to explore, like a claim that falls apart doesn't necessarily have to get abandoned. We could go back and see if the problem was one of logic or one of data. And if it's one of logic, then maybe there's something else that explains the apparent connection that seems to exist in the data. As one thing goes up, another thing goes down. Maybe there's a relationship there, right? We want to be open to that idea, and to do that, we're going to build theory, right? Now, theory is a really tricky thing. In the social sciences and the physical sciences, those two broad approaches to understanding the world around us use that term theory very differently. For our purposes, in the social sciences, theory is generally understood to be a set of statements or a set of propositions that is attempting to explain or predict a particular aspect of social life. So we start with a theory, and from that theory we derive a hypothesis, which we then go and test with data that's collected in the field, which leads to either support for that theory or a diminishment of that theory because the hypotheses that it's generating aren't supported by the data when we subject them to testing. In the physical sciences, a theory is a thing that has been established after years and years and years and years of testing, right? So theory is the thing you end up with in the physical sciences. Theory is the thing you start with in the social sciences. So, sometimes there's a little bit of friction or confusion or a little mental shift, right? That you have to understand that within a particular discipline, there is often a very specialized use of language. And this is one of those instances where if you're coming from a predominantly physical sciences background, and you see the word theory, it's really important to remind yourself that the way we use theory in the social sciences is a little bit different. At the end of the day, it's all in service of the same project, right? We are going to test our claims about the world with evidence and data. But just understand that we use the word theory in a particular way in sociology, and it may or may not align with what you've come to accept as theory. It drives my friends and colleagues in the physical sciences nuts, because people will go over there having, taken some social science classes, and they'll start talking about, the age of the earth, or they'll start talking about human evolution, and somebody will say, well, that's just a theory. And it's like, theory in the physical sciences is pretty rock solid. And in the social sciences, theory is obviously a little more tenuous, and it would be appropriate to say, well, that's just a theory. We won't really know if there's any weight to it until we get out there and start testing it. So just kind of keep that in mind. Interestingly enough, in both the physical sciences and the social sciences, the testing of theories is something that hinges on this thing we call falsifiability. So back to my claim about seltzer, right? There's no way to falsify a claim that seltzer is awesome or seltzer sucks. Falsifiability just refers to our ability to test and disprove a theory or a claim through the application of experimental conditions or observation, right? We can test something to see if it is in fact true or not. We can't test whether seltzer is awesome. We can't test whether seltzer sucks. We can test whether this can contains 32 ounces of liquid. So the claim about the volume of the container is a falsifiable claim. The claim about the nature of seltzer is not. So in general, science doesn't really want to or need to or feel there's any value in engaging in trying to empirically demonstrate the accuracy or the inaccuracy of claims that can't be falsified. Whether seltzer is awesome or sucks isn't a scientific question, right? Because it can't be tested using scientific principles. I do want to say a quick thing about proof, because this is, one of those, this is really, really sort of dragging out a little bit, and thanks for hanging in there. I promise we're almost to the end of this particular video. But there's this idea in some circles that science proves things. And I want to be really, really clear. Science doesn't prove anything. Science disproves claims. So, we have this idea of gravity, right? That if I were to drop this pen, if I were to open my fingers and release this pen, it will fall to the desk, right? And we'll test that. Let's see. Yep, sure enough, fell to the desk. That doesn't prove that it's going to happen again, right? What will prove that it happens again is that I release my fingers and this drops to the desk again. And because we can always subject this claim that the pen will fall to the desk, we can always subject that claim to testing, it always remains unproven until we get to the end of time, right? So what I'm proving is not that the pen will fall to the desk, but I'm proving that the pen won't fall to the desk, right? So I'm proving the null claim. Or I'm disproving the null claim. I'm not proving it. I'm disproving the null claim. I got a little inside science baseball there, and I apologize for that. But it is really, really important, because people today, again, people who don't really have any formal training in these fields, will go out there and they'll say science proves this or science proves that. And again, it's really, really important that we understand what science is and what science does, because the expectation that gets created from the idea that science can prove something creates a lot of pressure on science. And when science does what it does, which is refine its understanding of things through a series of tests, people are like, well, you said this at one point in time, and now you're saying this other thing now. How can we trust anything that you say, right? That's a claim that's being used to disprove, say, for example, the interventions against COVID, or the claims about global climate change, right? When we're making predictions about what things are going to look like 50 years from now, the range of possible outcomes is really, really wide. But as we get closer and closer to the present moment, the range of possible outcomes is narrowing. It's because the collapse of those possibilities, if you're thinking about time going in reverse, the collapse of those possibilities occurs at the present moment. Once the present moment passes, we know what the past contains. When we're thinking about what's going to happen in the future, we can only deal with probabilities or speculation. But as we get closer to those trials, as we get closer to those moments in history that will test our predictions or our claims, we can know for sure which of our claims was accurate, right? And so that cone narrows over time as we move forward in time. The problem is, of course, if people say, 20 years ago you were calling it global cooling and now you're calling it global warming, or 20 years ago you were calling it global warming and now you're calling it global climate change, right? The expectation that science is something that one person does one afternoon and definitively proves something is a misunderstanding of what science is and how it operates. So for us, it's actually even worse, because in the physical sciences, the things that they are studying there, behave much more regularly and predictably than the things we study in society. The things we study in society are human behaviors, and human behaviors are perverse. They change, they shift. People change their behavior knowing that their behavior is being observed, right? So how do you study that, right? It's a really, really difficult thing. There was a sort of a very famous how would I put it? It's kind of I can't remember where the quote came from, but somebody once said, it is impossible to take a clear picture of a fuzzy object, right? And you can kind of figure out where the aphorism is kind of going. In our case, society is kind of the ultimate fuzzy object, right? American society in 2022 looks very, very different than Saudi society in 2022. And that looks pretty different than Chinese society in 2022. And that looks pretty different than Venezuelan society in 2022. But American society in 2022 also looks different than American society in 1922 or 1822. So because the thing that we're studying is changing across locations and across time, we're always kind of building a contingent, qualified explanation for human behavior. Under these conditions, we see the following patterns. If the conditions change, the patterns presumably will shift to reflect that. And again, seeing that connection, seeing those relationships is the essence of what Mills calls the sociological imagination, right? The ability to see the impact of social forces on our lives and the lives of others. And it's embedded. Critical reasoning is embedded in that sociological imagination. Now, Mills makes a distinction, and you've read it, I hope, in the selection. But Mills makes a distinction between what he calls troubles and what he calls issues. And here's where the value of a sociological perspective, I think, really reveals itself. A trouble is something that results from the operation of individual level variables. It's something that's happening to you, or it's something that's happening to me. An issue is something that transcends the individual and kind of is the result of institutional arrangements and historical processes and all of that. So things that are happening at the level of society. The thing is, things that happen at the level of society are still going to be experienced by us, right? And I'm going to experience an issue as if it's a trouble. It's going to feel like a trouble, even though it's an issue. So I can't look at my own experiences and know for sure whether I'm experiencing a trouble or an issue, because they both feel the same. Think of unemployment, right? Unemployment is a societal level phenomenon. Not having a job is an individual trouble, right? So unemployment is an issue. Not being able to find a job is a trouble. I could be looking for a job and struggling to find one because I'm a bad interviewer, I'm not qualified for the positions I'm applying for, my resume is a hot mess, I just come off as an unappealing potential employee. Or I could be struggling to find a job because, there are a lot of people looking for jobs and a relatively small number of jobs available, right? Nothing in my experience is going to tell me which it is, right? Every interview I have is going to end with, thank you very much, we'll be in touch. So nothing in my experience is going to tell me whether what I'm experiencing is a trouble or an issue. So we can't look to the individual perspective and the individual experience to understand society, because the person, while they are embedded within society and they're very much a product of that society, they are not a society, right? So what we need is a way to sort of step back from that individual perspective and start to look at the bigger picture. And that is what Mills calls the sociological imagination. It's essentially a way to put the individual or a group of individuals into a context. And context is a really, really huge thing in society. It's basically all of the stuff in the world around us that is shaping and constraining our actions and the actions of others, right? So taking a step back and saying, okay, so I can't find a job. Maybe I need to see what the unemployment rate is. And I see that the unemployment rate is, 12%. Okay, that's probably why I can't find a job. If I step back and I say, oh, the unemployment rate is 3.2%, maybe it's me, right? So in other words, we need to find a way to sort of engage a way of looking at the world and a way of gathering information that's informed by the possibility that our individual experiences may in fact be the reflection of something that's happening at the level of society. And that's what we want to do. We want to kind of take a look at social problems, but try to understand them as social problems, if you follow. And so we want to make sure that we put all of this stuff into context. All right, so that takes us to the end. And I know this was a really long one. Normally I like to try to keep these things short, but there was a ton to talk about. So the next one I think will be much more brief. So thanks for hanging in there. And until next time, take care.